Okay, good evening, everyone. It's 5 o'clock, so we're going to make a start. Just to let you all know from the very outset that we are recording this evening's session, and this recording will be made available to you after the session, so I'll be sharing the link with everyone. So welcome again to everyone, and tonight we're bringing you a really excellent webinar about staff training, which we're really excited about. Before we get stuck into the content, I just want to go through some administrative things. So for those of you who are BACB certificates, you are eligible for receiving 2 supervision learning CEUs for this evening's live event. So Niall, our presenter, will provide you with 2 codes throughout the session this evening. So you just need to make a note of these 2 codes, and then at the end of the session, I'll provide everyone with a link, and you can follow that link and you'll receive your CEU certificate immediately, as contingent on you filling in those 2 codes correctly. Okay, just to let you know, for those who are watching the recording afterwards, CEUs are not available. So it's only for those of you who are joining us live this evening. Before we start, I just want to tell you a little about who we are. So my name is Dr. Michelle Kelly, and I am the ABA Program Coordinator and the ACE Coordinator at Emirates College for Advanced Education, which is based in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, because I know we have lots of people joining us from all over the world. Here at ECAE, Emirates College for Advanced Education, we offer the only graduate verified course sequence with the Association for Behaviour Analysis International. So just a quick overview of what we do offer. We offer a 1-year postgraduate diploma in ABA, which covers all the coursework requirements to become a board certified assistant behaviour analyst. We also offer a 2-year Masters of Education in Applied Behaviour Analysis, which covers the coursework requirements to become a board certified behaviour analyst. And we are in the process, which is very exciting, of putting together a proposal to offer a 4-year PhD in ABA, which will be the first PhD in ABA, certainly in UAE, in the GCC, and to our knowledge, the region. So we're very excited about this development. And I also just wanted to bring to your attention some upcoming events that we are hosting at ECAE. And again, all of these events will be recorded. So if the time doesn't work for you, you will be able to view those recordings afterwards. So at the end of this month, we have our first session of the ABA Journal Club, which is offered by the ABA Journal Club and ECAE's Research Office. And this will be a 1-hour, 1 CEU event. In each event, a different article will be analysed. Spaces are restricted to allow for active discussion on these topics, and these events will either be in English or in Arabic. This first event will be in English, but we will be offering Arabic only sessions as well. So we're really looking forward to this first event, where our moderator will be Manal Al-Irani, who's a BCBA and is a co-founder of the ABA Journal Club. In October, we are delighted to have Nipa Bhutani. She will present on acceptance and commitment therapy, so really excited for that. And you can register for all these events where you registered for tonight's event. And the last event that we are hosting for this semester is a webinar called Precision Teaching and Frequency Building in the Classroom, and this will be presented by Dr. Aoife McTiernan from Ireland. So we're really excited for this event. Please feel free to share with all of your colleagues. And again, these are all free. CEUs are being offered, and you can just register at the same link that you registered for tonight's event. And that's it from me. So if anyone has any questions for me, please just email me at mkelly@ecae.ac.ae. So now I would like to hand it over to our guest speaker this evening, Niall, who will introduce himself and tell you a little bit about himself. So Niall, if you want to share your slides.
Thank you to Dr. Kelly and Dr. Murray for the invite, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. So the topic of today's talk is competency-based staff training within ABA. This is an area that has been of great interest to me, and it has prompted me into investigating, as part of my PhD research, techniques such as programmed instruction and behavioral skills training with regard to training in positive behavior support. That's research that I have conducted with London South Bank University. I also work with the Jigsaw training, and Jigsaw is an autism charity, and we're working on some really exciting things at the moment. So we hope to be able to tell you all about some really useful solutions to ABA and PBS staff training issues in the near future. I suppose before going into the nitty-gritty of how you can use competency-based training in ABA, the first question that we need to address is, what is competence? It's a term that's become a lot more popular in recent years. Its original use was in legal contexts, and it referred to who could and who could not give evidence during a legal trial. So if somebody was competent, they could give testimony during a trial. This later became adopted by businesses, and people started to propose that competence rather than intelligence was a better indicator of management performance. Following on from that, people began to develop competency frameworks aimed at meeting the needs of business, corporate needs. So they designed competence frameworks to identify excellent performers, to facilitate training, and for pay purposes. Today, competency frameworks or competence frameworks are used across many professions. You'll find them in teaching, you'll find them in business, you'll find them in medicine. And the word competence refers to the ability to apply knowledge and skills in the real world, and using performance outcome as criteria to evaluate what somebody has learned. So we can say that somebody is competent when they're qualified, capable, and able. So a competent person is able to understand and do certain things in an appropriate and effective manner. And that manner has to be consistent with professional guidance, ethics, and the overall public good. So behavior analysts, we want to see positive outcomes for our clients. But the most significant predictor of client outcomes is the quality of support provided by our staff. And training, supervision, and performance management are the most important determinants of the performance of direct support staff. So if our training and our supervision are not adequate, then the quality of support that our clients receive will suffer as a result. As ABA providers and professionals, we need to be able to identify the skills required from our staff team. And once these skills are identified, we need to train people in their use. So our training needs to be performance-based and competency-based. Now, what do we mean by performance-based? Performance-based means that participants in training should demonstrate the target skills during training. Okay? And competency-based means that training continues until staff are observed to perform the skill correctly. If somebody has not performed the skill correctly at the correct level, then training is not complete. You train until competent. Just remember, the role of a behavior analyst is not just to be a transmitter of knowledge. It is to be a coach of the supervisee's learning process. And that role is reflected in the BCBA 4th edition task list. As you can see here, competence-based training is an important feature on this task list. In addition, we need to design and use effective performance monitoring and reinforcement systems, design and use systems for monitoring procedural integrity, and provide supervision for behaviour change agents. We're going to be touching on a lot of these different areas during today's talk. Before we talk about competency-based training, we probably need to talk a little bit about what is often the default option. The way that most staff training across most areas works is that the normal way that people are trained is using a workshop-based approach. These will typically be composed predominantly of lectures, but potentially with some guided discussions, presentation of case examples, maybe some group activity and some role playing for some of the training participants. And the thing about workshop-based training is that given that most of it is directive and takes the form of just trying to transmit knowledge to people, what we can say is it treats trainees as passive receptacles of knowledge, that we are pouring water into a bucket, if you will. And the issue with that is that a lot of the time, trainees do not remember a lot of the information that they receive during workshops, and a lot of the time they do not have the opportunity to practice the skills that have been taught about. So I think now we will have our first poll. If Michelle, you are ready to send that out. So the first poll question that we're asking is, when acting as a student or a trainee, how effective have you found workshop-based training? Great. So what we found in terms of the results there, I'm sure most of you can see them, is that probably the largest answer that we got there was that most people found it was effective. Nobody said it was very ineffective, but 15 of 100 people, or 15% of people said that it was ineffective. Now, what we'll do now is just, we'll answer this question in a minute, but we'll just also ask you is, when acting as a supervisor, how effective have you found the use of workshops to train staff? I'll give everyone 1 minute to answer that question. Great. So one of the interesting things is that while 15% of people found workshops ineffective when they were the person receiving training, that reduces to 11% of people when they're doing the workshop-based training. I think one of the issues that we sometimes have with workshops as people who provide training is that we sometimes overestimate their effectiveness. within the chat, and either Michelle or Clodagh will hopefully summarize for me since I can't see all of your replies at the moment. Could you just list some of the advantages of using workshops when you are in the student's role? Do you find it effective for teaching principles or procedures? Do you think that it encourages ethical practice? What are some of its disadvantages? I'd like to just get some feedback from you all around how you experience workshop-based training as a student. Hi, Michelle. What kind of feedback are people providing to their experience as being trainees at workshops?
Yeah, thanks, Niall. Some advantages here are that you can observe others applying the principles of ABA. So that's a great one, Sarah. So thank you for that. Anyone else want to comment on their experience in terms of workshops? Lama said it is effective, especially when it has role plays. So I agree with you, yeah. Lama. Actually, role plays are, for me, I find them quite useful as well. Anyone else have anything they want to share with the group?
I think, oh, here we go, yeah.
Another one, Dr. Sarah saying that one great advantage is that you can train a large number of people at once. And certainly the opportunity for discussion in a workshop is very helpful, that interactive component. Yeah, and Arpana agrees with Clodagh that Q&As are very useful. Dr. Missy said it is most effective when they are interactive and require competence to be demonstrated. Thank you for that contribution.
That's really valuable. And I think that people are highlighting some of the really useful things that you can do within a workshop. So things like observations, things like rehearsing through role play, things like receiving feedback from people and being able to ask questions, all relating back to that interactive element. And obviously being able to do that with a large number of people is really, really advantageous. I think I think we've actually veered into also talking about some of the advantages from the perspective of acting as a supervisor, being able to train large numbers of people. So I think one of the disadvantages that there is to using a workshop-based approach is the fact that if you are training the larger number of people you're training, the more difficult it is for people to engage in like role plays. Yeah, I think we've got rid of that feedback now, hopefully. Yeah, so the more people that are involved in the training procedure, the harder it is to actually observe people correctly, the harder it is for people to ask individual questions. And that makes it more difficult to utilize a competency-based approach within the workshop. Now, it's not impossible, it just becomes more difficult the more people that you train. And you have to go about it in a far more structured way. Now, as used within ABA and more generally autism and intellectual disability training, workshop training is also not competency-based. And the way in which many behavioral analysts perform training, on occasion myself included, is that we do not use the same level of rigor that we would use when we are teaching our clients. So if you look at how we would typically teach our clients, we make sure that we use evidence-based practices. We are very good about using data, and we make sure that our instruction will be either mastery or fluency based, and we'll use learner-placed instruction. But a lot of the time when we're teaching our staff, we'll frequently use methods that are not empirically validated. We will often not take data. We will not require staff to demonstrate mastery, and we expect people to proceed through the material at the same pace. So it's not learner-paced like we would use it. Workshops are often aimed at the average learner, so at the average staff member. As I've said before, we don't teach to mastery within them a lot of the time. We don't collect data. And a lot of the time, it depends on the location that you're working in. One of the main aims of conducting workshop-based training is that it is often to meet institutional or regulatory requirements. So sometimes training is carried out not to improve staff skills, but to provide the organization with some form of legal protection or protection from reputational damage. In recent years, within ABA, we've seen increased interest in competency-based training, and that can be seen in the growth of a number of things like competency frameworks. So I've listed a few different examples here for you. Some of them may be familiar, some of them may not. These are organizations who produce documents along the lines of competency frameworks. Just a quick question to the chat. If you all already use a competency framework or a similar item, what do you use? Just to get an idea of what kind of things you all use as part of your work.
Hi, so Niall, maybe if you mute while I talk.
Yep. I'll try to get this.
Yeah, sorry, I think it's just both of us are, have our mics on. There might be some feedback. So I'm just going to read some comments from the chat. So please, everyone, share your comments. As I said, not everyone can see them. Do try to write them in the drop-down menu to all panelists, so that me and Niall can both see them rather than privately. That would be great. Thank you so much. So some of the comments are, some people use the standards from the BCBA and ABAI. NEPA uses the Competent Learner Model, or CLM. Lucretia uses the YMQI, which I'm not familiar with. If you want to write what that acronym is, and I can read that out, or maybe Niall's familiar. Lauren is saying the RBT task list and ethics guidelines. Great. Thank you, Christopher. MCQ questions at the end of presentations. We have another one, the performance diagnostic checklist. NEPA is just further describing the CLM competent learner model, saying that it has its own data tools to measure staff behaviours, which is great. Hi, Dr. Shannon, who says that she uses Garza et al. 2017 workbook when training and supervising BCBA candidates. We had the competency assessment from the BACB. Reka is also talking about the competent learner model, where they use instructional checklist, which is competency-based, which is great to hear, Reka. Shireen also says that she uses the RBT and BCBA task list. And Sarah is saying that she used elements of the UK ABA competency framework and the RBT framework. And thank you for clarifying the YMQI is the York measure of quality of intensive behavioural intervention. So thank you all so much for your comments. Keep them coming. So I'll mute myself now, Niall. Just unmute yourself there, Niall.
Great, I should be unmuted now. Yeah, so you can obviously see there's been a lot more interested in competency-based training, and it's great to hear that people are utilising competency-based frameworks. Obviously, not everybody uses a competency framework or will be familiar with them. So I'm just going to give a brief description of what these are. So the development of competence has always been an aim of training, but you can't simply assume that competence has been attained just because somebody attended a lecture or workshop. The way that people have traditionally identified the absence of competence is by looking at the results of it. So where somebody has been incompetent, they've demonstrated that incompetence, and that's how we've identified it. But with competency-based training, we require the explicit demonstration of competence. So we, as trainers, must see that competence. Until we've seen that competence, training is not complete. And remember here, when I talk about competence, it's not just about technical knowledge, it's not just about performance, it's also about ethics and professionalism. And those are just as key to competence as any sort of technical knowledge about principles or procedures. So a competence framework is something that allows us to identify knowledge, skills, and values. And those knowledge, skills, and values combine to form a competency. The competence framework, by identifying what the components of a competence, allows us to use evidence-based modes of assessment. And it improves accountability at all levels of training. So it improves accountability for the institution that is providing the training or who are having their staff trained, for the supervisor and the supervisee. It allows all parties to demonstrate that professional capability has been attained and demonstrated. What I want to do now is actually just talk a little bit about a few different competency frameworks that have been developed. These you may be familiar with some of them, and you may be less familiar with some of the other options, but I also want to talk you through how one goes about identifying competencies and constructing a competence framework. And that is something that some of you may wish to do within your own work environment. And because while we can create general competency frameworks that are aimed to identify competencies required in a profession, within your own work environment, there may be additional competencies that are not required within the general professional population. The first one that we're going to talk about is the Applied Behaviour Analysis Technician qualification that's issued by the QABA. You can get some details about that if you follow the link. To be certified with the ABAT Potential, there are some requirements that are listed here. Some of these are fairly standard. 18 years or older, high school diploma or equivalent, 40 hours of ABA and autism training, 15 hours of supervised on-the-job training, and you need to get a score of above 73% on 100 license examinations. Now, those requirements may change over time, and you can check them at the below link. Many of you kind of made reference to the BCBA requirements, so things like this is effectively the equivalent of an RBT qualification. However, one of the things that you'll notice there is that there seems to be, potentially some more additional autism training that you might not encounter on every RBT course, and that 15 hours of supervised training on the job is required, as opposed to a competence assessment, which is what you would have in your RBT training. Now, the QABA did not just kind of pull this criteria out of the air. There is a process that you can go through in order to develop a competence framework. And what you need to do if you're doing that is conduct what's called a job analysis. Now, there are 4 stages within a job analysis. There's the initial development and validation, a validation study, a development of content areas, and validation of content areas. This is the process that the QABA followed. So what did each of those steps involve? The first step was to review the literature. So they looked at other job analysis conducted for similar roles. But I believe this is a US credential, but I believe it's offered internationally as well. However, if you follow the links, you can check the eligibility requirements on the QABA website. So So they started off by reviewing the literature, and they looked at job analysis for similar roles. So those roles would have related to types of roles involved in the intellectual and developmental disability sector, roles within behavioral health, roles within autism sector more generally, and best practice guidelines for ABA. And by doing that, they were able to identify 19 standards. Now, I haven't listed them all here, but they will relate to things like legal and regulatory requirements, knowledge of autism, Asperger's, high-functioning autism, specific principles and procedures when ABA, philosophy and values, things like challenging behavior and person-centered planning. After this, they turned to the experts. So they formed a panel of experts who reviewed the standards and rated the standards based on their knowledge of existing research. They rated them using a 5-point Likert scale, ranging from not essential to fundamental. And based on those ratings, the QABA refined the standards. So they identified 14 core competency areas and 87 skill sets. And using those, they basically ran some examinations with some candidates, and then they received some feedback from the candidates themselves. And they used that to weight these different items as well. So they asked people questions like, how often is it used in daily practice, and how important is it? So those were the 4 steps that the QABA went through in developing that credential and identifying the relevant competencies. And the work, obviously, that was done by the QABA was really good. But if I was to criticize this, it would probably be that while the ABAT is based on the competency framework, it does not assess competency formally as part of issuing the credential. The formal assessment examines knowledge, but there is an assumption that performance and competence will be assessed as part of the supervision process that those who have an ABAT credential will have to undergo. So an alternative approach will probably be...
Niall? Yeah, if I could ask you to mute there just for 1 second. So just before you move on to the next competence framework, there was a couple of questions in the chat, and I thought it would be useful for you to address them right now. Just related to the QABA. First of all, someone asked, is it equal to the RBT? And the second question was, where is this credential recognised?
Okay, so the credential is equal to the RBT. It's very similar to the RBT, but obviously across different legal jurisdictions and in different countries, different commissioners and authorities recognize different credentials. It is an American qualification, and I believe that within certain regions within the US, it is growing in popularity. The reason I actually selected it was because the QABA provided lots of detailed information about how they went about identifying the competencies. And I also thought it would be an interesting one for people to hear about, just because it is, as has been noted, it's similar to the RBT, but it's targeted more towards people who work with autism. So it's just an interesting credential to look at, in the sense that it has identified slightly different competencies that will be relevant to people who are working within ABA with people for autism. With regard to how you qualify for it, if you follow the links, you can find more information on the eligibility requirements and the training that's required for it. One of the interesting things about the QABA qualifications is I believe that your training they will accept training provided from a BCBA. If that's based on memory, but I believe I'm not mistaken. Okay, so did I answer any questions at this start?
Yeah, thanks, Niall. Obviously, a lot of our attendees this evening are based in the UAE, and it's quite imminent that the BACB is no longer going to be credentialing behaviour analysts here. So obviously, people are looking to alternatives. So I guess people are just considering if QABA would be a credential that would be worth exploring here as a behaviour analyst in the UAE. Should we be unsuccessful in our application to continue BACB certification here?
Great, thanks for that, Michelle. Yes, obviously that's an important context, and I can imagine that lots of people are looking at different certification options. I guess one of the things that is useful about looking at how the QABA did what they did in creating this credential is that it should provide people with a general idea of how to go about creating a competence framework, whether that's for your own workplace or for a particular team within that workplace, or whether you were looking at something like that on a national or multinational level. The next competence framework we'll talk about is the UK ABA Education Competence Framework. I believe somebody mentioned that within the chat earlier. For those of you who are unfamiliar, it's an assessment framework for recognizing the established competencies of ABA tutors and identifying their development and supervision needs. Its focus is on outstanding teaching and learning. As we can see, one of the things that I wanted to highlight here within the forward to the competence framework is to point out that one of the points of having the competence framework is to define the knowledge and demonstrable behaviours that are important for anyone in UK education settings working with children and young people with autism and using ABA. Aside from when we're looking at training needs, competence frameworks are also really useful in helping commissioners, parents, other consumers to identify whether or not something is truly ABA, or whether it's because if people receive training that covers those different competences, then they may be then that may well be a legitimate ABA provider. But if they don't cover, if the staff don't have these competencies, then is it really ABA? So competence frameworks also have benefits for consumers. So these are the different areas that the UK ABA competence framework examines. You can see there at the intersection between knowledge of autism and ABA, professionalism and education. There at the intersection is where they find outstanding teaching and learning. As we said, the point is to ensure that children and young people within schools progress as a result of high quality evidence-based education delivered by competent staff. And it provides greater clarity about the nature of and use of ABA in educational practice. So just to reiterate, having an accepted framework allows consumers to identify if something is or is not ABA. Again, here are the different areas that they have identified, and you can see some similarities to what we saw with the QABA's paraprofessional qualification. There are areas such as looking at ethics and values, looking at child development, and the various elements of communication, teaching and learning, safeguarding. All of these different elements are different areas that are related to various competences. And just to give you some examples of what those various modules look like, these are some of the areas that are covered within them. Now, I'm not going to list all of those there. I'm just showing us on the screen, so if you want to look back on the video later to go into that in a little bit more detail, you can see it there. So, as we've seen earlier, with qualifications, Like the QABE's offering, like the RBT, training is about 40 hours or so. Within the UKABA Education Competence Framework, the assessment of skills and knowledges occurs longitudinally, so it's over a 2-year period. Now, in some cases, that may be a little bit quicker, in others, it may be a little bit longer. You get the general idea there that it's typically about 2 years. And this is just an example of the process that somebody would go through. So people are taken in here at stage 1. They may receive various forms of training that address the different modules within the framework. At these points where there are triangles, that's where there is some sort of assessment. Now, that may involve things like teaching observations, it may involve certain quizzes, it might involve moderation of portfolios. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a couple of minutes. So again, you see that very much within the framework, the idea is that this is very much the training is a longitudinal process. And just again, each of the modules will have knowledge that it examines, which you can see in the left-hand column here, but there will also be demonstrable behaviors. It's the idea of looking at both knowledge and demonstrable behavior. As we said earlier when we looked at the ABAT, the assessment of actual competence was there wasn't an exam. There is similarly tests of knowledge within the UKABA competency framework. However, there are also other forms of assessing actual competence. So these include these various options here, which I will talk about now. The test of knowledge typically consists of multiple choice quizzes and short answer tests. The moderation of evidence portfolio. So an evidence portfolio will involve a trainee looking at the various work that they're doing and taking examples of it. So, for example, if a trainee was collecting ABC data, they may use some examples of ABC data that they collected to demonstrate competence within that particular assessment area. If they were at a point where they were scripting short-term targets for a learner or making suggested changes, that might also go into the evidence portfolio. If they were taking data collection for a task analysis, that might also go into their portfolio. That portfolio is then reviewed typically by their line manager, who should be a BCBA, and that could be used to demonstrate some competence. There are also supervisor rating forms, which will typically use rating scales to say if somebody has not met, or if they've partially met, or if they have met a certain competence. Self-assessment is also a feature. So the trainees are also supposed to identify various elements that they consider themselves competent in. And this may then be discussed within a learning meeting between them and the supervisor. So as you can see, this differs in the sense that both knowledge and skills are assessed. However, there are no explicit proficiency standards for some of the standards. It sometimes comes down to the subjective judgment of their supervisor. And while there are some standardized competence, there are some competence assessment tools that have been shared, or some common ones that might be used between organizations who use the framework. There are no standardized competence assessment tools. So what that means is that there's an element of subjectivity within the assessment of competence. And also there's no standards for how training is provided within that competence framework. So the next framework that we're going to look at, and the last one. Sorry.
Quick question for Niall, if you can just mute there for a second. Oh, sorry, I was going to ask you to go back in your slides. Just with that UK competency framework, all of those self-assessment tools, this is a question from me, by the way. Can you just share your slides again, just so I can read them, and go back one where you underlined the difference, you know, there was like an assessment for supervisors, etc. Would they be accessible? Because they would be really useful resources for our audience, or is that something you have to pay for, or is it licensed? Yeah, here, the personal development portfolio, the self-assessment form. In the slide beforehand, you had one about assessing the supervisor, I think. Yeah, so would these be available? Yeah, the supervisor rating form.
As far as I'm aware, a lot of these resources have not been published. However, I think that's not because people don't necessarily want to share them. So it's certainly something that I could make some inquiries around. I have some of them myself, but also they're not forms or tools that I have developed. But I'm sure that a lot of these should be it should be possible if people are interested to send some of these on once we get permission.
Yeah, and just because a lot of, sorry, Niall, a lot of people are asking in the chat just for resources, and I think people just really are, you know, really interested in developing a bank of resources as it relates to supervision and staff training, and we will of course make all these resources, including the slides, available to you after the session. But just an interesting comment came through there in terms of contextualizing it, Niall, within the UAE. In one of our attendees' experience in clinics in Dubai as a supervisor, the clinics don't give time to the supervisor to establish such tools and feedback. And this attendee has experienced a lot of pressure on utilization rates and billing direct services to clients. And of course, yeah, she really believes this should not be the case. And another comment that came through is that someone thinks that the QABA framework is available online if you do search for it. So perhaps we will be able to access those resources, and of course we will share those with the attendees afterwards. But I'm glad our attendees are contextualizing it and putting it into the context of the UAE. And thank you to Dr. Clodagh, who's sharing some useful links in the chat as well. Thank you, Niall.
Yes, thanks for that, Michelle, and also thanks for those comments. Just responding to that before I talk about the third framework is just to bear in mind, when I'm discussing these various competency frameworks and these different methods that we have, I am aware that there are obviously behavior analysts and other professionals in this area work in areas where there are issues at institutional levels which are barriers to training. So not everything that is mentioned here today may have good contextual fit for the environment that you're working in. But my hope is that you will see, at least from some of these different examples, that you will get some ideas about what might fit within your organization with the resources that you have. Okay, so the third framework I'm going to talk about is the CABAS framework. That's the comprehensive application of behavior analysis to schooling. So I'm not going to have enough time to do this, to fully do justice to this, but the CABAS system is developed around the concept of the Learn unit. And the Learn unit, and this is just helpful for understanding some of the tools that they use, a Learn unit is interlocking three-term contingencies between a teacher and a learner. So problems for learners in acquiring new skills can be located in any part of the Learn unit. So the development of CABAS training structure and materials was driven by a desire to improve staff performance, because they realized that staff performance is the most important determinant of what a client learns. This is just a general description here of the various models and how it's developed. We're going to talk a little bit about teachers and people within the assistant teacher roles. But it's important to know that there are various curriculum and training resources that are related to supervisors, parents, students that are also part of the CABAS model, and we won't be fully touching on those today. So with CABAS qualifications, there are 4 main ranks of certification at the moment that I'm going to touch on. There's a teaching assistant, teacher 1, teacher 2, and a master teacher. So completion of each rank requires at least 1 calendar year of full-time teaching. So like the QABA Education Competence Framework, the training within the CABAS system and getting those qualifications is something that is done longitudinally, and it is done in practice. The approach that they use is based on Keller's PSI, and we're going to talk a little bit about PSI later, so I won't go into too much detail on it now. But there are 3 broad repertoires that they look at, and these are verbal behaviour about the science, which could be translated as knowledge, contingency-shaped repertoires, which relate to skills, and verbally mediated repertoires, which I would probably describe as being related to analysis. So unlike the previous 2 examples of competency frameworks, there are commonly used clear, measurable, objective criteria for the assessment of the repertoires within these areas. This is just a quick example of one of the criteria that you might have for assessing knowledge using the CABAS framework. So you complete a quiz that will be looked at by it will be corrected by a proctor, and you'll be given feedback on it. And once you've achieved the requirements, you'll be signed off as having achieved that component. For contingency-shaped teacher procedures, what we're looking at with contingency-shaped repertoires is application experience. It's implementing ABA procedures. And this is just an example here of a potential target that you would have, which would be that the trainee was accountable for 50 objectives achieved for 4 students with learn units criteria appropriate for students' level of verbal behaviour. That's a little bit kind of complicated, but it's effectively saying that it's a little bit complicated if you're unfamiliar with the phrasing. It's effectively saying that this person has helped 4 students to meet 50 short-term objectives, they've learned 50 operands, and that they've done that at a level that is appropriate for those 4 students. Then when we're looking at the analytic experience or the verbally mediated repertoires, it would be a case of a criteria might be that the person had 15% or fewer graphing decision making errors for a minimum of 20 opportunities across various programs that the students they work with have. Within that system, there's a recognition that children can only progress as fast as the expertise of those who teach them, and teachers can only progress as fast as those who teach and mentor them. And because it's a science-based system, there are basically specific knowledge and training requirements for those who train the people who are trying to achieve those competencies. And those people who are providing that training also need to demonstrate certain levels of knowledge and competency with regard to providing that training. Just to come back to skills assessments, the most commonly used one is something called a TPRA. And what the TPRA does is it looks at the different elements of the learning unit. I don't have enough time to fully go through all the various elements of using a TPRA. But basically, you have a learn unit, which is going to be familiar to most people here. It's basically breaking down the 3-term contingency. And it's got 2 interlocking sets of 3-term contingencies. So basically what we find is that you can see from this example that the student and the teacher behaviours can act as antecedents for the other person's behaviour, and they also consequate each other. What the TPRA assessment does, and the TPRA stands for Teacher Performance Rate Accuracy, is that it will provide you, it allows you to assess the teacher's correct and incorrect responses, as well as the learner's correct and incorrect responses. And before a supervisor conducts a TPRA, they'll ask the staff members some questions about procedures, what's the objectives of instruction, what schedules of reinforcement they're supposed to be using, any behavior management strategies, etc. What we see here is just a quick example of a completed TPRA. On the left-hand column here, you see the coding that is used. So we see this little tick here. That means the antecedent was presented correctly, whereas if we see the same tick with a circle around it, it means the antecedent was presented incorrectly. If we look at this first trial, we can see that the teacher presented the antecedent incorrectly. We can also see that it was followed by an incorrect student response. And so I'm not going to go through each element of this. We can see that the correction operation was carried out correctly. We get a general idea of both the fidelity with which the teacher is presenting the intervention, and we also get an idea of how the student is responding to that. And this is a somewhat, if all of this coding is a little bit intimidating, you can always adapt the TPRA in a way that might be a little bit less for you. So this is one that I adapted previously. Just bear with me for 1 minute. So again, it's about examining procedural fidelity, but also looking at how the student is responding in these situations. So you can use something like a TPRA to assess competency and to monitor performance. And this can happen both on an individual staff member level, but also on an organizational level. So for example, within this is a graph from 2013 to 2014, which examines the cumulative number of TPRAs carried out at the Jigsaw school. So you can see that over time, that is increasing, but you can see that the performance, the level of training and support people are getting is relatively consistent. You can also use that to examine individual staff members and identify who needs the most TPRA to be conducted, so that people are getting that feedback. The names are obviously removed from the bottom of this chart, but each of these bars relates to an individual staff member. You can see if they are getting their TPRA, if they're meeting the criteria, or if they're not meeting the criteria with regard to correct and incorrect responding. And that can then be used by supervisors to identify where that training is needed. So just in summary, CABAS approach tends to use a behavior analytic approach to training and supervision as well as the organization. And the completion of those training ranks is linked to job roles and pay increments. The competency is identified in behavioral terms and assessed to a mastery criteria. Knowledge, direct support skills, and analysis skills are all assessed, and trainers are verified as being competent by performing TPRAs and providing feedback. So the use of the Learn Unit teaching and TPRAs enables objective assessment and performance management, and that makes the organization more effective and accountable.
And the fact that they are so TPRAs are an excellent resource, and one of our attendees provides parent training via telehealth and actually uses TPRAs to assess her client's parents implementing procedures with their child, which I think is a really great use. And it's also really adaptable, because I mean, it's essentially your ABC table, really, isn't it? So I think for all the supervisors in our in attendance this evening, it's something that I think as supervisors would be easy to adapt in terms of when we are doing staff training or supervision of our staff. And as Dr. Clodagh said there, linking the staff progress and performance to pay and promotion can also be definitely useful.
Yes. Yes, and I think one of the things that I would really like, especially the behaviour analysts in the audience, to fully understand is that if you are carrying out your training with the same rigour, with the same integrity that you provide interventions to your clients, um, then you will already be utilising a competency-based approach. And we should expect that we will get the same types of benefits that we will get from adopting those strategies when we use them with our staff teams as when we use them with our clients. So just coming back to when we talked about competence-based training, one of the things that you will have seen when you examine those three different frameworks is that there is typically a distinction between what somebody should know and what somebody should do. And behavior analysis, what I'm going to do now is look a little bit at knowledge, because behavior analysis is a long tradition of increasing knowledge levels to mastery. And there's three different things that I'm going to touch on briefly, three different areas that I just want to remind a lot of you about that you can use for teaching knowledge and ensuring it's taught to mastery levels. So just quickly, the three areas we're going to talk about are PSI, programmed instruction, and direct instruction. Just to get some feedback from the chat, how many people have ever used any direct instruction, personalized system of instruction, or programmed instruction-based learning materials, either with their clients or their staff? Right. Those has.
Hi, so yeah, just to recap on what everyone's saying there, so several people have used personalized system of instruction, PSI, Sarah uses direct instruction, DI with clients. Nipa is telling us that the competent learner model, CLM, is actually based on PSI for staff training, which is great. Quite a lot of you are using direct instruction, which is fantastic. So a lot of PSI and a lot of DI coming through here, and just one person has used PI.
Great, thanks for that. It's really encouraging to see that people are using all of these different techniques. What I really want to encourage people to do is to make sure that you're incorporating these different techniques into your staff training. Brilliant to hear that things like PSI are being used as part of the competent learner model. We always have to kind of remember that if you're not training to mastery, then people are not going to retain. So any technique that trains to mastery is obviously going to have massive advantages for you. So while it's great that people know about all these things, I'm going to give really brief overviews of those three methods. Direct instruction was designed by Engelman, and initially it was designed to help disadvantaged children succeed academically. Key features would include that it's typically fast-paced, scripted lessons, with teacher-directed lessons, with the teacher showing and telling, and that's punctuated by group responses in unison. As the method evolved, it came to incorporate many behaviours principles more explicitly. These include overt practice, social reinforcers, ongoing feedback and correction from the teacher, and lessons developed using extensive testing and revision. I've put mastery learning in bold here just because that is really important, and also will typically feature data collection as well. The results from DI studies tend to be really impressive. It's been found to be the most effective intervention for at-risk children. It's been found to be one of the three comprehensive school reform models as well. And basically, it's been found to be really effective for things like numeracy, literacy. It's been used in lots of different circumstances to teach lots of different skills to people from lots of different backgrounds and with various conditions. There's a couple of suggested readings suggestions there. The first is using a model of direct instruction to teach summary writing in a college reading class. And it's also something that's being used in teaching critical reading skills. I included those two reading suggestions just to emphasize the fact that these direct instruction can be used to teach skills that are sometimes described as higher order cognitive skills. Within ABA, where we use direct instruction, a lot of the time it can be as part of curricula that are looked at, let's say, teaching basically introductory reading skills. And it's just to emphasize the fact that you can also use direct instruction for teaching advanced concepts. And for obviously, if you can use it for things like teaching people critical reading skills, it's obviously something that you can use to teach people about principles and procedures within behavior analysis. Apologies, I'm not going to be able to show you the video for BSI here today, but I will share the link. BSI is something a lot of people will be familiar with. It was developed by Fred Keller initially for introductory psychology courses. He was looking to come across a course structure that would maximize student success and satisfaction. BSI involves sequential units, self-paced learning, mastery-based learning, and feedback from a proctor. That proctor is somebody who will correct and provide coaching that's required to correct mistakes. I've given a couple of different examples here, but one of the things about PSI is that it was really successful and was found to be really effective, but it was also quite labor intensive. So while it was used at universities a lot of the people who were constructing the courses complained because it was labor intensive. You need to have multiple versions of different courses. You needed to have a team of proctors who were often more experienced students, and it fell out of favor. And what tends to happen in recent years is that PSI has made something of a comeback in terms of e-learning and with regard to computerized learning, because the role of the proctor can be taken on by the computer. And also you can automate you can basically automate assessments. It's easier to construct multiple versions of various tests as well. The final one of these behavioral techniques we're going to talk about is programmed instruction. It's based on Presley's teaching machine, which was first released in 1927. And you can probably see an example of it there on the right-hand side. With these teaching machines, a correct response is immediately followed by a reinforcing stimulus. Programmed instruction as developed began to incorporate behavioral principles such as shaping, prompting, discrimination training, stimulus fading, priming, and lots of other things. So programmed instruction was essentially used to author apps prior to the widespread availability of computers. What's it look like? Information is contained within frames, which are presented in a logical systematic sequence. Typically, a frame will be a single screen. And each frame contains at least one blank that requires the learner to construct a response. It's self-paced, and terminal objectives are set before you start learning. So this is just a quick example of a frame. You can see here that we are looking at trying to teach people about functions of behavior. And you can see here that there's elements such as prompting. If the person clicks submit, they'll get some feedback immediately for their response. So programmed instruction has been found to be really useful, and it's been successful at teaching things like mathematics and biological concepts, psychology. It's been used in terms of teaching creativity and things like that. And it's also been useful in where it's been incorporated into systems you might be familiar with, such as Headsprout. But we're asking ourselves, okay, does it really matter how you teach knowledge? This is just some of the findings from some research that I conducted here in comparing knowledge acquisition across 3 different methods. So the first one that we have the example of is programmed instruction, which was carried out online. The second was a standard online instruction format, and the third was a workshop. And as you can see, the kind of most effective outcomes, training was most effective for the participants who attended the programmed instruction, even though all 3 groups were very similar at the pre-test. So yes, what we do know is that a lot of the time, the method you use does make a difference. And that's why we should use methods that are evidence-based, that are data-based, that utilize objective behavioral definitions when it comes to learning goals, that incorporate mastery and fluency-based learning, and that are learner-paced. So we're going to move on now and move on from the knowledge, the things we need people to know, and we are going to move on to what we need people to do. So looking at skills-focused training. So one of the methods that you will probably have heard a little bit about is behavioral skills training. Behavioral skills training, it's an evidence-based protocol for teaching staff specified job skills to be performed. And just to be clear, it is evidence-based protocol for teaching staff, but you can use it with if you're working with children with autism or anybody else. It is both performance-based and competency-based in that it requires people to demonstrate the behavior, and it continues until they have demonstrated that competency by meeting mastery criteria. It's been used in behavioral research and applies settings to train a variety of important job skills. So there are 5 steps within behavioral skills training. First step is to describe the skill to be trained. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. The next thing is you might provide a written summary of the skills to be trained. And then you would demonstrate the target skills, have the trainee practice their skills and provide them with feedback. That can often be done in role play, or it can be done when working with a client, depending on circumstances. And then you repeat steps 1, 3, and 4 until they demonstrate competency. Really neat in terms of how you can describe behavioral skills training. Those 5 steps describe it quite well, but we're going to go into each of those steps in a little bit more detail. So, as we said, the first step is to describe the skill to be trained. Be as detailed as possible when you're doing this. Provide a rationale for why the skill is important to that person's job, and break down the skills step by step into a performance checklist. Now, that's a skill that a lot of you already have because you're used to constructing task analysis. And all the same rules when it comes to constructing a task analysis would also apply to using a performance checklist. That performance checklist allows the supervisor to have an objective tool to monitor correct use of the skills after the training has finished as well. Step 2, we said, is provide a written summary of what's to be demonstrated. So we can give them a written copy of the performance checklist. Keep it streamlined, not any extraneous information, just the really important stuff. So just the meat. A fully developed plan can still be filed somewhere else, but when you're actually providing that training at that moment in time, you can just focus on keeping it nice and streamlined to the key points. So if you're using this as part of a group, make sure every participant gets their own copy. I know that might seem obvious, but sometimes people will forget to do that. And just remember, it's also really useful to provide this written summary because some staff learn better by reading than being told what to do. And it's just useful to do it in that way. It also gives them that kind of permanent record of it. The next thing you do is you demonstrate the skill. That's typically done in a role play, but as I said, you can do it in the environment as well. Normally, the trainer would take the part of the staff person, and an assistant takes the part of the individual being served. That could be actually one of the trainees as well. So the supervisor performs the job skill, and if the supervisor does not know how to perform the skills, corrective action should be taken so that the supervisor gains the necessary skills. This is just a really crucial point, but the supervisor needs to know how to perform the skill before you would ask them how to train somebody else in the use. That seems really obvious when we're talking about something like discrete trial teaching or things like that. But if you were looking at something like a behavior intervention plan or a behavior support plan, that supervisor may never have implemented that behavior support plan before. So it's important that they know how to do it before they try and train somebody else in use. So that demonstrating, that modeling is really important. But just remember, you can also use other means other than carrying it out in role play. You can use video modeling at this point as a training aid, which may be more practical in some circumstances. Or as I previously said, you can do what's called like in vivo training, as in real life training with the actual individual who you are supporting. That's best in one-to-one training situations. It works far less well if you're trying to train a group. Step 4, provide feedback. So we're going to give an opportunity to answer all the questions of the staff. You will highlight the components that were performed correctly and identify which areas were incorrect. And just as a general piece of advice here, make role play as fun as you can. Reward the good performance and give a chance to demonstrate the areas correctly. And just make sure, as in all training scenarios, that you are maintaining rapport with your trainee. Your feedback, especially positive feedback, is only going to be reinforcing to that person if they value that feedback from you. So you need to make sure that you are establishing good rapport with those individuals. Again, step 5 is basically repeat. Okay, so you repeat until competence is demonstrated. This means that you may need to continue your training like in small groups because you need everyone within that group to demonstrate competency. So if you're planning this, you're planning to use behavioral skills training, allow for the fact that it may take some people longer than others to reach that competency level. But ongoing monitoring and feedback on the job will be necessary, especially if you're doing this in vivo. But that ongoing monitoring and feedback should go on indefinitely. You might reduce how often you're doing it, but you should never stop monitoring and providing feedback for performance. That performance checklist we talk about, that is something that you can use to provide that feedback. So, for example, you could use something like the TPRA form that we discussed earlier for doing that. So within training, you may practice the skill and role play scenarios. However, the person should not be regarded until you have observed them performing target skills with their clients. That means even if somebody is competent within that training scenario where you're using role play, do not take it for granted that that means that they can do it in context. Make sure you take the time to go observe that person if you can. It's not always possible if you're in, for example, a consulting role, but try to make sure that you get to observe that person performing the target skills with their clients. Right. So at this point, I think we're just going to run another quick poll and then get some just some general kind of feedback and comments from the chat.
Yeah, so just while your poll answers are coming through there, if anyone has used behavioural skills training either as a trainer or as a student, please share your experiences in the chat, and we'll have a little discussion. For now, I'll just close this. So you've just got 20 more seconds to log your answer. Okay, and I'll just share those poll results with you all. And I'll also just share some comments coming through. Okay, so one long comment here. So one of our attendees is currently doing their MSc and ABA dissertation on staff training, and they're trying to understand what's being used and in what context, and they've done a systematic literature review. They've searched for hours and days on end for articles, and a lot of them are coming back on using BST. And this attendee wanted to understand the other elements that go alongside the practical training and if this impacts learning acquisition and maintenance. For example, a theory workshop alongside BST or BST alone. And yeah, the attendee is just saying this webinar has been so useful so far in helping understand and expand on his introduction discussion. So big thank you to Niall. So does anyone else have any comments about BST? Have you used it? Have you been a student as a recipient of learning skills of BST? Dr. Shannon says that she believes BST is necessary, but it requires making people feel comfortable. So I think that comes back to what Niall was saying about that, the importance of the rapport building. And Niall might have more to say about that. Another attendee is saying for BST, the goal should be to be able to maintain the skill for long term, and just having that constant reminder, visual checklists and slides definitely help. Any other comments regarding your experience with BST? Linda says that she likes that BST ensures repeat till mastery, but that can take a bit of time if the trainee is struggling. And BST also needs to ensure that the trainer is not only competent fluent, but also a good teacher. So thank you for that, Linda. And Arpana agrees with you, Linda, that she thinks it works really well, only it is very time consuming. And Ali says that they use BST as part of a peer training program with RBTs, and they found it very effective for encouraging the development of new skills. Nipa is suggesting that BST followed up with in vivo and continued practice is great. So thank you for all those comments coming through. Couple more coming through, if you can just bear with me, Niall. Sarah's saying that she thinks time is an issue, particularly in the UK, where they have relatively low contact with technician level practitioners. So a few people commenting on the time requirement, Niall. Dervla is saying that there's an article by Novak et al. In 2019. It's really useful. Thank you for that, Dervla. We'll share that with everyone. The title is Evidence-Based Performance Management, Applying Behavioural Science to Support Practitioners. Thank you for that resource. Shireen is saying that's good to have the practical part of ABA, not just theoretical. Myra is saying I am training parents via telehealth using BST. I'm using RIRD and collecting data. So an important thing to mention right now during COVID-19 and the fact that BST can be successfully done via telehealth. I don't know, is there any publications on the effectiveness of BST using telehealth? Niall, you might be able to speak to that. And then Nipa just said, in terms of that time requirement, investing in time for mastery is certainly worthwhile if it means better outcomes. And Lama said that BST is a great tool to teach RBTs how to teach social skills. So thank you all so much for those comments. So I don't know, Niall, do you want to just pick up on that time requirement, since a few people mentioned that, and perhaps if you know anything about the delivery of BST using telehealth given the current pandemic?
So I suppose the first thing is just talking about that investment of time. So behavioural skills training can require more time because you need to do it in lower groups and you need to take longer time to get to mastery. However, that does tend to depend on what level of supervision that you are giving somebody to begin with. So Behavioral skills training, as I said before, especially if you're providing it, let's just take the example of, let's say you're working with somebody who you're supervising and you're observing them practice with the clients. So there could be an RBT supervisee, or it could be a supervisee who is hoping to get their BCBA. During those kind of observations, you can utilize BST to train them in the use of a technique. Now, in those types of situations, that's not you taking extra time to use that technique most of the time. It's something that you're just incorporating into everyday practice. So what is sometimes a good idea is to make sure that if you're not going to be there that often, that you try and train the person who is going to be there the most often in the use of behavioral skills training. So for example, if you were consulting for a school and there was a class teacher, what you might need to do is one of the first things you might need to do is teach them how to use behavioral skills training. And one of the great things about behavioral skills training is that you can use it to teach behavioral skills training. So teaching people how to competently use behavioral skills training can be used within the tiered service delivery model. So you can make sure that if you're not going to have enough time to work with everyone at the technician level and use behavioral skills training, teaching the people above them to be able to use behavioral skills training should, in some circumstances, be an effective solution to that in business. It's great to see that people are looking at behavioral skills training more. Somebody touched on the fact that behavioral skills training is something that's recommended frequently, and it is evidence-based, and it is fantastic. But how you use it and when you use it, like that has not really been explored as fully as it could. And that's when we get into the area of kind of implementation science. We know that as a training package, behavioral skills training is a really good procedure that we can use. But on the other hand, we're not quite sure when we're using it, for example, what the mastery level is for something. So for example, if you're using behavioral skills training to teach somebody how to use discrete trial training, you kind of need to be able to identify proficiency standards. It's all well and good to say teach to mastery, but what is that mastery? Is it delivering a single discrete trial correctly, or 20 in a row? Or what level of error is required for that? But also, it's looking at, is it required for everything, or can it be used as part of a blended approach, using it in conjunction with things like, for example, programmed instruction, direct instruction, personalized systems of instruction. So a lot of those questions have yet to be asked, and I think that when we start to look at people using it as part of telehealth, you know what, I seem to remember reading something about that once recently, but I wasn't actually able to access the article at the time, and I don't know if they actually completed it. It's an area that you could very easily do, because remember, behavioral skills training is basically involves your instruction, your modeling, your feedback. These are the key elements that you're looking at. So when you look at providing, let's say, describing the skills, yes, you can do that online. You can do that. Can you provide a written summary? Yes, you can. And can you demonstrate the skills? Yes, you can if you're doing that online. It's the feedback element that you need to basically provide. Now, you can provide that feedback online. Some people find it more difficult to do it that way, but also some people will probably prefer it. So to answer the question, can it be done as part of telehealth? The answer is there is no reason it can't. With regard to how effective that is, we've found that telehealth and ABA in general can be really, really helpful, can be really beneficial. But as ever, telehealth is not an intervention in and of itself. It's rather describing a medium through which you conduct your practice. So there will probably be ways in which you can do this that will be effective, and there will probably be ways that are not going to be effective. So okay, so I'm going to, we've already talked a little bit about that at that point. Okay, so we're getting through to the final section here, and hopefully that means we'll have some time for any more general questions or comments that we can have in the open chat. We're going to actually talk about the individual components that we talked about within behavioural skills training. So behavioural skills training has been found to be really effective. And these four components that we're listing here are the individual components that have been found to be really important. But instruction, prompting, modelling, and feedback are all really important. The most important one, you should probably not be surprised to learn as a behaviour analyst, is feedback. So we're going to go through each of these and look at some practical advice around how you're providing instructions, prompting, modelling, and feedback to the people that you're training. Providing instructions. You're providing instructions vocally. Think about what you want to say before you say it, and be specific. Separate the instruction from the description. Separate out the rationale. Just try to be really clear and try and make sure that you have very simple, clear sentences that summarize the key points. If you're working with a supervisee and they're working with a client, think about its impact on that session. So is it going to interrupt the flow? So that's just a factor to consider when you're providing vocal instructions. Written instructions are really good, especially when you're trying to build independence. Because remember, just because somebody carried something out and we're able to carry it out within, let's say, a behavioural skills training session, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to remember your modelling or the instructions that you gave the next day. So make sure that you're kind of taking full advantage of using written instructions. So about, for example, how to conduct a preference assessment, how to use a task analysis, all those types of things. Written instructions are really valuable. So prompts are, as you're almost all undoubtedly all aware, supplementary stimuli that are used to occasion a correct response. So when initially training, the trainer may provide prompts to occasion the correct demonstration of a technique. The example I give here is that the trainer may point to a token board to remind the trainee to implement the reinforcement procedure on the trial. And just remember that the considerations that you need to be cognizant of when you are working with a learner, a client, an individual with autism, a student, whoever, with regard to prompting, they still apply when you're training someone. So try not to use intrusive prompts where you can, or try to move from more intrusive prompts to less intrusive prompts over the course of a training session. So looking at your vocal prompts, again, they're quick to deliver, but will they interrupt the flow? Could they become part of the chain for that person? But they can be helpful to act as things like reminders. Visual prompts, so that can be written, symbolic. They need a bit more time to be prepared, so they're a little bit less flexible, but they can be really useful in illustrating a sequence and summarizing it. So again, here when we're looking at a summary of a discrete trial, just having that kind of visual or written sequence can be really useful for someone. Gestural prompts, they're quick and unobtrusive. They're really useful, I find, when you're training someone. They're dependent on the trainee understanding the gesture, and they're a little bit limited in terms of complexity. But again, if you just need to remind somebody to carry out the next step, they're really useful. Again, modelling, a key part within behavioural skills training. With models, similarity matters. So you identify with your trainee and they identify, and more importantly, if they can identify with you, they are more likely to model the behaviors that you are trying to get them to engage in. Again, I can't emphasize enough, you need to build that rapport with your supervisees. Staff that you're supervising need to see you as a source of reinforcement. And again, your models, they should be emphasizing the salient features of the behavior you are demonstrating. If you're going to use verbal models, if you're going to use kind of verbal instructions along with your model, label only the salient features of the behavior, only the features that are actually important. Model at least twice before ever trying to get a trainee to imitate. Yeah, that's a really good point, Coda. Again, modeling immediacy is important. When demonstrating a new skill or behavior, try to make sure that the trainee imitates immediately following the model, if that's possible. And then go to introducing a delay between the model and imitation when building independence for the trainee. You could also use that delay in unplanned situations as well. Pacing, when it comes to using modeling within a session, model slowly to begin with, and then you can build up the pace with future repetitions. The final part here is looking at feedback. Research shows that feedback is the most important criteria for successful training outcomes. So you can provide that feedback vocally, or you can provide it in a written form. They can provide information on what was successful and what could be improved. Okay, so just quickly, can people write in the chat, how do you like to receive feedback? So do people have preferred forms of getting feedback? Do they like to get all of the positive feedback and all at once, or do they prefer to just get the negative feedback? Some people sometimes find things like, sometimes people will provide feedback in a kind of compliment sandwich, where they say their supervisor will tell them something good they did, then tell them something they did that needs to be corrected, and then tell them something else they did. But some people really enjoy that, whereas others people kind of just feel it's a little bit condescending, or it can actually condition up the positive feedback by pairing it with aggressive, and it becomes punishing. Yeah.
Okay, so just some of the comments that's coming through. A couple of people are saying they don't like that sandwich, so they're adamant they don't like that sandwich. A lot are saying they would like to know both the corrective and the positive. Some prefer verbal and written feedback, and some say receiving is actually easier than giving feedback. A lot of calls for verbal and written feedback. Honest feedback, but that will help you improve your performance. Direct feedback, of course, within the 4-to-1 ratio. So yeah, we certainly want to be aiming towards that 4-to-1 ratio if possible. Someone's talking about the importance of being descriptive when given feedback, and others talking about the format, receiving feedback in private, clear, constructive, again, no sandwich. Quick corrective feedback in the moment is fine. If the feedback is more serious, please do it privately. Yeah, a lot of people saying they want feedback to know where they should improve. Another attendee, Sarah, saying she prefers written feedback so that she can see all the good and the bad bits and process it all together. And she thinks it's best to receive feedback immediately, so you can make those changes quickly. One-to-one feedback will be preferred. Another attendee, or model the correct behavior. Once again, straightforward feedback with clear direction and examples and non-examples. I love that, Hong. So yeah, it's really good to give examples of what you want as a supervisor and non-examples. Yeah, someone just highlighting the point that some people just may not be comfortable when feedback is being brought up in a group setting. So again, the importance of that one-to-one. Dr. Missy, when giving feedback to employees, to be able to provide examples of behaviour and specific changes that need to be made to performance. And I think that's really important that, you know, as a supervisee or as a trainee, you know, you're told specifically what you need to do to perform your performance. Yeah, so and another thing to consider is scheduling opportunities for extra practice. So thank you all so much for those comments.
That was really useful, and it's clear that many of you have thought long and hard about that, because it is one of the most difficult things that people will often find within their environment, in their work environment. Giving and receiving feedback can be difficult, and what we're going to do is just talk through a few different strategies around providing that feedback. So what makes it successful feedback? Well, one of the most important things is the ability of the trainer to identify strengths and weaknesses in practice. And this links back to what we've talked about, making sure that the people providing training are competent themselves in whatever they're providing feedback on. And again, having something like the TPRA, like a performance checklist, that acts as an aid for that trainer in identifying correct and incorrect practice, and help those trainers to identify where the strengths and weaknesses in practice are. Also, the ability of a trainer to prioritize areas of weakness to identify appropriate training targets is really important. General advice I will give is that limit feedback to a maximum of 3 targets in one session. You can follow up later. Involve the trainees, so encourage reflective practice. So, for example, one of the things that I did that was similar to what I think somebody in the chat mentioned was once getting some of my supervisees to video their performance, then to CPRA themselves, to then have an inter-observer check with myself on them CPRAing themselves. And then just asking lots of open questions around, okay, so do you feel that you did this appropriately, or this, or how could that have been done better? But that encouraging reflective practice is something that you want to do within your session. Make sure the trainer provides clear identification, demonstration, and instruction for the targets identified. Again, the trainee may not have understood exactly what they were supposed to do. So again, identify it exactly and demonstrate it as part of that feedback process if necessary. Formal feedback should be at the end of a session. So if you are, let's say, providing staff training within a classroom or within a centre, the formal feedback should happen at the end of the session. Somebody said giving quick corrective feedback while you're doing some observations is not going to intrude, but if it's formal feedback, wait at the end of the session. Try to review feedback with people before a new session begins. So just give people a little bit of a reminder about the things that they've agreed to try and work on. Support formal vocal feedback with written feedback. Again, that is useful both for accountability purposes, but also people, when they're getting feedback, can be very nervous and they might not take in everything that you're saying. So providing that feedback in a written format can be really useful for those trainees. Right. Comment on the behavior and the processes, not the person. Okay. So avoid using emotive language, saying things like you must, you shouldn't, you need to, don't do this. Okay. So focus on the target behavior rather than the incorrect behavior. Not saying don't do this, say what you want the person to do. Say what you want to see. Okay. But be specific, and that helps all parties concerned be clear about expectations and avoid any possible misunderstanding. So I'm going to ask for a couple of suggestions I'm giving you some examples of things people sometimes say, and I would like you to kind of suggest an alternative. So the first one we'll say is, you forgot to close your discrete trial.
Okay, so as I know a lot of the 100+ participants we have this evening, a lot of you are supervisors. So instead of saying you forgot to close your discrete trial, how might you give that feedback in a more appropriate manner? So one attendee has suggested, Niall, were you able to provide a reinforcing consequence for your trial? Another attendee has said that she thinks it depends on the preferences of the person to whom you are providing feedback. There's not a single alternative that will work for everyone. So it really needs to be individualized for your supervisee or your trainee. So it's good to see some alternative ways of expressing it.
Okay, that was really great. And just for time considerations, I'm not going to go through each of these or ask you about each of them. But what I want you to look at is actually the first couple of words in the first three examples, for example. It's like, you forgot, you must, you seemed. Right? Those are, obviously, there's going to be linguistic differences and things like that, depending on where you're working, but try to avoid those types of phrases. So what I'm going to suggest is, here are some alternative phrasing that you could use. So even if it's, I've seen some better examples there from the chat for that first one, but like saying something like, instead of you must ensure, you could say, it is important that the pupil responds within 5 seconds. So it's, again, it's depersonalizing it. Because when you provide highly personalized comments as part of your feedback, people feel that you're criticizing them as a person and not their behavior. So try to focus on that behavior. Again, feedback acceptability is something that some of you have touched on earlier. So again, try to measure feedback acceptability where you can. But as some people have said, everyone is different, so the best thing to do is ask the trainee how they would like their feedback to be delivered. Would they like it to be immediate, or would they like it to be done at the end of the day or at the end of the week? Would they prefer if it's verbal only or written only? It can be any sort of combination of the above. Again, as people have touched on, feedback should always be private, or as private as the training situation can allow. If you've got really good rapport with somebody and you really know them well, there might be some situations where you make an exception to that, but speaking generally, feedback should always be as private as possible. So I'm going to start summing up some of the main points that I would like you to take home with you. So competency-based training, it's great, and it helps ensure that you make sure that the people that you are supporting receive quality intervention. And it also makes you as a professional accountable, and it makes your organization accountable. If you want to use competency-based training, you need to know what competences you're going to train. And the competency framework can be really useful for that. There are various options out there, but you can always develop one for your specific workplace. And if you would like to do that, you can follow the 4 steps involved in conducting a job analysis. And again, that is something that once it's done, you should kind of be continually refining based on feedback from the various stakeholders. If you're using an existing framework, consider, right, is the framework, does the framework involve assessments of both knowledge and competence? Are there competency assessment tools? And are there proficiency targets? If you're lacking, if the framework doesn't provide you with proficiency targets or competency assessment tools, those are things that you can develop yourself, or you can look to alternative frameworks to for ideas about how to do that. I advise that you utilize evidence-based behavioral approaches, things like PSI, DI, and PI, to teach knowledge. Some of those methods can also be used for teaching skills, but the easiest way in which to use them is probably when you're looking to teach knowledge. They're really effective and really time-effective, resource-effective in terms of delivering mastery-based training. Utilize methods such as behavioral skills training that utilize instructions, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback when you're looking at the demonstrable behaviors that you want to see. Again, remember that to be a competent practitioner, you must be an ethical practitioner. So do not shy away from examining the ethical practice of those you are responsible for training. That includes when you are acting as a staff trainer or supervisor, but even so, remember, avoid the use of abrasive procedures when you are providing things like feedback. You should be a conditioned reinforcer. Your feedback should be meaningful. Do not try to do anything that might humiliate anyone or embarrass them. Part of your goal in terms of doing staff training is to improve the outcomes for the client, but it's also to improve the quality of life for the trainee. They are the person who is going through the behavior change procedure within the training context. So you need to make sure that you're making this meaningful for them as well, and you're not going to do that if you are using things like abrasive procedures. Okay. Now, that was everything that I needed to get through. So what I would like to do is just ask people if they have any general questions or comments.
So just while any final questions or comments are coming through, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Niall for his wonderful presentation this evening. He's really introduced us to a lot of new resources, has really explained the topic really, really well. So I'm excited to share his slides and all the resources that he's mentioned, and indeed all the resources you've mentioned in the chat. So I'll compile everything and get them to you as quickly as I can. But thank you so much, Niall, for this wonderful webinar. We really, really appreciate it. For those of you attending live, in the chat, there's a survey link for you. When you close out of this session, it will actually automatically bring you to that survey. So I'd really appreciate it if you would all complete that survey. Thank you so much. And I've also provided you with the link for your CEU cert. So if you click on that, you'll be asked to enter the 2 verification codes or keywords that Niall provided to you throughout this evening's session. And once you enter those correctly, you'll be issued immediately with your CEU cert. A lot of comments coming through saying, thank you so much, great topic and detailed presentation. It was wonderful, very helpful. There's one question. From Dave, is the effort level in developing PI-based staff training excessive? He's wondering in relation to PBS awareness training for social care staff across an organisation. So given that we've just a couple of minutes left, Niall, do you want to address that in terms of the effort level in developing a PI-based staff training?
Thanks, Joan. Thanks, Dave, for the question. The effort level is somewhat reduced given the existence of existing competency frameworks and some existing training resources that are already out there. The main thing you would need to be concerned about if using a programmed instruction approach is not the development time, but the actual time it might take some of these staff members that you are working with to complete it. And that's obviously going to be because they may be coming from a diverse background in terms of their levels of education that they've had before, the levels of training that they've had before. So you need to make sure that when you are designing that PI-based system, that you clearly identify what prerequisite skills you expect people who are going to undergo that training to have. If you do that, the development time is less than you might imagine. The average development time for e-learning courses is about 40 hours of development for every 1 hour of instruction. In my experience using PI, you can develop the materials in an amount of time that is considerably less than that.
Great, thank you for that, Niall. That's fantastic. So thank you so much. And David said very helpful. Thank you, Niall, in response to those questions. A couple of you were asking about those verification codes. Niall did provide 2 key codes or verification codes during his session. So you'll just be asked to pick those when you follow that link. So I'm going to finish up here now because we're 1 minute before 7. So thank you so much again, Niall. Thank you to the over 100 attendees that attended this evening. Thank you so much. And I will be sharing the slides, resources, and a link to the recording following this talk. So thank you again, and hope to see you at the next event. Thank you and good night, everyone.